Welcome to Planet People Mining Season 2. I'm your host, Allison Koppel. Here we present the stories of trailblazers at the crossroads of mining, sustainability, and communities. Hear what motivates top professionals in this field of impactful work. Accompany them as they describe their challenges and explore the issues they tackle. And for our Spanish-speaking audience, busca Planet People Mining en español. Using data to listen to and build trust with communities with Dr. Kieren Moffat. Today I speak with organizational psychologist Kieren Moffat, CEO and co-founder of the firm Vaconic. He spent his early career at a mine site where he was inspired by the signs posted outside the fence, both supporting and opposing the mine, and was left wanting to understand how the two sides could build a better relationship. He then led research at Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, to initially debunk the concept of social license, only to become one of today's top global experts. In 2019, he co-founded Vaconic, which provides tools so that companies and industries can listen to community voices and learn how enabling a fair, transparent, and consistent experience can lead to deeper trust. Kieren holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Queensland. Kieren, so it's fun to have you on the podcast because we were supposed to have this 100% in person, but here we are both at the Social License and Mining Conference in Arizona, both not only just in the same time zone, but actually in the same building, but the logistics were just not working.
It's great to be here, and don't worry, it's just how show business works, right? We just sort of keep secret how the sausages are made.
Exactly. Well, first, I always like to ask my guests to catch us up on what are a few work and life milestones.
Right, milestones. Well, I guess a big one that, well, I understand is big now, but not at the time, was working in a consultancy while I was sort of finishing my PhD, and I was working at a mine, delivering a leadership program for supervisors and hating it, hating the work, hating the content. But the drive in and out every day was really interesting because the miners would put up signs that were saying things like the mine's great for the local community, and every day that was in response to signs that community members had put up saying, get rid of the mine and the mine is ruining the environment. And it was really interesting to me because they were having this conversation and I could just sort of see it playing out day by day. And it was much more interesting what I was doing on the inside of the fence. The conversation going on across the fence was much more interesting. I remembered that back to when I started at CSIRO, our National Science Agency in Australia, and eventually got to a point where I could kind of explore that conversation in more detail. So I look back on that experience and think that was pretty formative actually for me and really piqued my curiosity in this space.
What made you want to work at a mine in the first place?
Before that, I'd been working at another consultancy, sort of part-time work. I was finishing my study and that was in health mainly. And a mate of mine who I was doing my PhD alongside, he had got a job with this other consultancy. It was a bit shinier and had a cooler office and they worked exclusively in mining. And I just went there because he was there and it sounded pretty interesting and pretty cool. And knew nothing about mining. And I got to know a bit more about the industry and the sorts of things that were aligned with what I was really interested in. And so actually complete accident. And, Tim Grice, his name, he runs a consultancy called Square Circle and does excellent work in the development space. And we're still good friends. And it's a funny origin story, really.
Flash forward, how would you describe your current role? Why is your work now important?
My current role is really an extension of what I have done professionally for 15 years or more, which is to really investigate that conversation that's going on between companies or industries or institutions and the communities and people that they're operating alongside. And I call it an extension because we literally spun that 11 years of research that I led in CSIRO on the concept of social license to operate out of that organisation to form Viconic. And it's changed a lot over the 6 years we've been operating, and to grow and develop quite a lot to keep up with the demands of the business and to really think ahead and to support the team in their work. It's important because of our mission, which is to give voice to communities and help our customers to listen. And that's something that drives us all and defines, what we're doing day to day and the aspirations that we have for the organization. So for us, it's important for the companies that we work with. And I think most importantly, it's important for those communities, often communities that have never been asked what they think about anything in any meaningful, systematic or ethical way. And to be able to do that is a real honor and responsibility that we take really seriously.
So help our listeners understand, if they're not familiar with Viconic, how do you describe the company that you run now?
So we take our purpose, which is to give voice to communities and help our customers to listen. We use a range of methods, primarily surveys, to listen to communities around a whole range of issues and interaction points that they have with a company, whether that's a mining company or a renewable energy company or an agricultural industry, and to do really interesting, useful things with that data to identify what is material or most important in that relationship that predicts trust in the company and acceptance of its activities. And we do that over time. So it's not just a one-shot research project. We're tracking those voices, those perspectives, those experiences that community have across time, supporting our customers to think through what those voices are saying, to think about that in the context of their work, their social performance plans and processes, and in terms of the actions they might take to deepen and support that relationship to be more productive. And in listening and responding to those perspectives of community, companies are able to build stronger relationships and reduce their social risk.
You said a couple of key things, and it makes me recall when I first met you, and I had read your paper before I met you. I think it was actually not officially published yet, or it was some earlier edition of a paper you wrote more than 10 years ago. And I was working in Chile at the time, and you came for a conference, and we're sharing around this concept of procedural fairness. And I have to tell you, when I first heard it, I didn't understand. And I'm reading this paper and I'm like, what does this concept mean, procedural fairness? And how does that explain how you build trust with communities? But then I heard you speak and really explain it, and I read it again, and my light bulb went out, and I said, this is really different. Because especially at that time, and I will say all too often, even today, companies were trying to get trust with communities of explaining to them, oh, but we're going to provide you jobs. And look, we've had this hearing where you told us your opinions, and that's it. You can kind of check the box that those concerns were heard. And then the company shares all the great things that it's doing in the communities and move on. And your work before you even formed this company helped really the industry, at least me at the time, have this huge light bulb moment to say, wait a second, it's about how do you measure that communities are having this fair experience, that the decisions that are being made that impact them are made on transparent criteria, and that this experience is consistent for them. It's really powerful. And I think even today, flash forward, at least, I don't know, 12, 13 years later, it's a very fresh idea that still very much applies. So I'm still very curious. I mean, how did you get to that paper that seems to me sent you on a different course of work?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. Well, how did we get there? I mean, when we started the work, we actually had the intention of getting in and blowing up the concept of social license. I've been observing CEOs of mining companies talking about social license in ways that were really quite disingenuous and didn't have a deeper understanding of what they meant by that. It was a useful device to wrap up everything that companies were doing in the external environment under the assumption that they had this thing, a social license to operate, effectively permission to do the things that they were doing. Whereas, in fact, the early writing about social license speaks to the power of community to influence development trajectories, and it really being a community concept and it being born of a metaphor to help mining executives understand that their responsibilities extended beyond the legal license to mine. So it's an imperfect metaphor to help people get their heads around a broader understanding of the relationships that their companies had with communities. And when we got into that work, we started reading that original literature, which was really based on observations people were making in the field. So really good stuff. But actually, if you step back a bit, the things that are in this concept of procedural fairness are features of any productive, healthy relationship. So you think of any relationship, you're going to listen to that person and you're going to demonstrate that you're listening and you're hearing what they're telling you. You're going to follow through on the commitments that you make to them. You're going to involve them in decisions that affect them. But the same is true of a relationship between communities and companies. So it's not a huge leap. And then there's a large body of work around this concept of procedural fairness or procedural justice that speaks to its power in those types of relationships between communities and others. And it's powerful in ways that continue just to surprise me, that if you were to improve procedural fairness in a relationship, the perception of your performance in that area, community members' experience of environmental impacts will improve as well. So they'll become less severe, independent of whether those impacts have changed or not. It is that powerful that the way I feel treated in a relationship colours everything about that relationship. And so, yeah, it is fresh in that it's a universal concept that extends beyond any single point in time or type of project or industry or anything like that, but also because it's the hardest thing to do differently. And it's, I guess, the most counterintuitive or new skill that companies need to learn to be more effective in the social performance space.
I like how you broke that down to the very human experience. I mean, if we just think that you are moving into a new neighborhood, when I lived in Colorado last, I had very nice neighbors next to us, and they had this huge tree. And the tree fell on our property during a big storm. And I think of that moment a lot because in that case, we already had a very good relationship with these neighbors. These were the neighbors we went to if my kids were locked out. They had our spare key. We were always helping each other out. We weren't necessarily the best of friends, but we were really good neighbors. And it wasn't the day that their huge tree fell on our lawn that we went over and introduced ourselves. And we decided together of how would we deal with this situation. They didn't cause the storm that made the tree fall. And I bring this anecdote back to what you said around decisions that have impacts in your life. You can break it down to a number of interpersonal relationships, like one you have with your next door neighbor. They could have just decided that this tree was going to sit on my lawn. They could have just decided that they were going to come over with a chainsaw and start making a whole bunch of ruckus and noise. They could have decided a lot of different ways to resolve this issue. But we realized the situation. We set criteria on how we were going to resolve it. We already had a pre existing relationship and we made the decisions together. And, I think of sometimes these concrete little touch points with the people in my life beyond my family to think, how do we structure this relationship, especially when sometimes things go wrong? And I bring that up to the company community relationship because I think your framework or the way that you've applied the procedural fairness framework in this context of social license is exactly right. Is who doesn't want decisions that impact their life to be made in a fair way? What I really like about it is your emphasis on consistency because in the example of, say, a mine and a community, maybe there's one person at that mine that you have a good relationship with, but there's three other who every time you walk by them, they're rude to you. Your perception of that mining company is going to be based on the weakest link, the person who was most rude to you. But if you consistently have a good experience with the mine, or you have a consistent experience of being treated fairly, even if you don't like them, even if you're not best friends, you're going to think they're all right. I trust them. And I think that's really powerful to bring it down to that individual level. I'm sure you've saved a lot of personal relationships too.
Well, lean into your story. I think you mentioned the critical component from my perspective, which is that you have a pre existing relationship. And that's the thing that is so fundamental, that the reason that you invest in those relationships and establishing norms or ways of working together and communicate your values and what you're about and where you share those with the other party is to build up that level of trust, to build up that level of familiarity, so that when the relationship is tested, you're not trying to do all those things at the same time as solve the problem of getting rid of the tree. So if you take that back out to a community context, if we kind of torture the metaphor a little bit, there are many cases where the tree falling down will be attributed to the company. We'll be saying, you did this, and not only did it happen because of you, but you did that on purpose. So these are the things that get misattributed when that relationship hasn't been deepened over time. And in our work, what we find is procedural fairness is in almost every single data set that we collect over time and across jurisdictions is fundamental in predicting or driving trust in the relationship and then acceptance or social license. And however, it's one of several components of a pretty consistent model of social license in different locations. So there are other things like how fairly do you distribute benefits, also really important. Not an equal share, but an equitable share of benefit based on some meaningful framework, which is typically impact exposure. Another is confidence in governance. So is there a set of rules that are applied to the way the company does its business that protects the vulnerability of community? And remembering that, a really good definition of trust is being vulnerable with another and knowing they're not going to take advantage of that vulnerability. So strong governance framework, whether it's regulation or an internal framework, your checks and balances as a company, that's something that protects the vulnerability of community in their everyday. And so there's lots of things that contribute to the nature of the relationship. But unless you're building that over time, then when things get inevitably more difficult, you don't have a resource to draw on and things are misattributed. And if you do that work, then it makes those more difficult things a collaborative conversation rather than a new conversation.
I like what you said about vulnerability, because I will say that my favorite part about your work and your tool is that you put the results online.
Yeah.
That to me is very different because I've worked at, a number of major companies, I've worked at a number of countries, and sure, we all do some sort of perception survey or some survey of what's the support level of this project. But that information I had never seen published. More than 80% of the people support this project. Now since I've really immersed myself in understanding your work and your tool, I saw that the other day in a project that I was reviewing. And I'm like, what does that even mean? 80% or whatever the number was support this project. Like, you've
Yeah.
given me no data to base that on. You haven't, in this case, the project proponent hadn't shown any demonstration of the relationship or what was shared or any piece of evidence to back that up. So I'm just assuming that people filled out this questionnaire or whatever it was with their historical bias of what they think this project should be or has been or whatever their thought is. But what I love is when you do your work in a community, the community and the company are seeing, at least at a high level, those results together.
Yeah.
And you can really sit down and say, at least the way that I've interpreted it, correct me if I'm wrong, Our transparency score has gone down since the last time. What are you expecting us more to do? Can we start there for help us understand what your expectation is? That is a much more concrete conversation than let me convince you this is a great project so you support me.
Well, exactly. And even better than that, what we see, so if that's the starting point, which is, hey, help me understand what you're telling me. So help me interpret this data. Let's do that together. That's a really fantastic starting point. And it immediately takes a lot of heat out of the conversation because you're asking community members to help you understand them using the data that they've given you already. You're not starting with, here's my position and let's talk about that. You're starting with, this is what you've told us. Help me understand what that means to you. But then from there, what we also see is the conversation then goes off in other really interesting, important directions into areas where we're not even measuring yet. We're not measuring those things that end up being talked about. It's a really impressive, powerful feature of having that open conversation with community driven by their insights to start with. The other piece here is that providing a summary of the data back to community is a fundamental component of an ethical process. So if you're not doing that, then kind of failing one of those first tests of ethical research. When we think about how we built local voices, for example, as a sort of local community engagement research product, every element of that is thought through to be in line with the ethical principles of research and what we're trying to achieve with the work, which is deepening the relationship to make it more productive. So feeding back the data is one component of that. Informed consent at the beginning of the process, another one. So everybody knows that this company is paying for this research, but we're conducting it on their behalf at arm's length, that we protect their privacy, that it's an anonymous process, and we'll never hand over identifying information to the company. And so in that way, the process itself becomes a social license intervention. And we can demonstrate this empirically. So every time we do a survey, procedural fairness improves by a small amount, but it improves by the mere presence of the process, independent of what actions a company then takes that might compound and improve that, I guess, social dividend off the back of the results. So what I really love about this work actually is that the same things that are important for community to feel closer to and to feel better about and more trusting of the companies that work alongside them are the same thing that companies should be doing to minimize their risk. So in that Venn diagram, there's this huge overlap in the middle around the things that are both in the company's interests and the community's interests. And most of our work is in helping companies to see that they should embrace that vulnerability, to share results, to engage community on the difficult issues, to do that in ways that they haven't tried before. And in doing that, to really elevate their social performance thinking and their approach, and to do that in a way that in a system that allows them to communicate that to the other parts of their business that are responsible for the impacts and many of the benefits that are derived from their presence. So it becomes more of a team effort, a collaborative effort across the business.
I have a feeling, I know the tool is set up for the company and the community to have a better relationship. I bet companies are better managed themselves after going through this experience and seeing the power of having this transparency and consistency and feedback loops to their performance.
What I observe is that vulnerability is a bit like trust. When we started doing this work, I remember presenting and somebody saying, why are you measuring trust? Trust is irrelevant in this context. And my response was, we measure it because the literature tells us we should measure it because it's likely to be important. So let's measure it. What do we lose by measuring it? And then what we find in the work is that trust isn't just important, but it's central. And so trust isn't this fluffy concept. It's not this sort of ephemeral thing floating around. It's actually a really pragmatic resource in the relationship. So then when we think about things like closing the loop and procedural fairness and building this deeper relationship, there was a time when you might think of those as fluffy concepts that, that's nice to have. And the joke about doing cups of tea and that's your job. And it's not a joke, it's pejorative, it's designed to be how it sounds, which is, sort of diminishing that profession. When in fact, in the process of engagement, you are deepening your understanding of the other. And that's what companies who embrace this do. And vulnerability as a concept is just like trust. Can feel fluffy. Actually, it's a skill. It's a differentiating skill. And companies who understand that not only embrace it in the context of their community, it's almost the last place they embrace it because it's felt that the risk is much greater if you're trying to do that externally. But we've worked with companies who embrace that concept in their leadership frameworks, how to be vulnerable with your peers in ways that are appropriate. And that's really important distinction here. It's not about throwing everything out there on the table and just being absolutely open about everything and vulnerable in every facet in every way. It's a being appropriately vulnerable, but it's a skill that needs to be practiced and rehearsed. And you need to understand what that feels like because you need to prepare for that and to be able to cope with it. But like any difficult thing, through practice, you develop that muscle. And companies that we work with do get better at those things and they are willing to embrace the levels of vulnerability. And we've got some really great case studies about, I'll be presenting one at the SLO conference this week here in Arizona from Lundin Mining, where a site embraced vulnerability and the turnaround in their relationship with community was dramatic and quick. It wasn't slow. It was as dynamic as every other part of the relationship. So yeah, I think you're right. It does change. And more I'm feeling like the data that we provide, the science that sits behind, it all leads us to the conversation of internal change within companies and how to support companies to embrace a different view of community and to think differently and act differently internally to then be able to express that difference externally. And that's where we start to see really amazing things happen.
Embracing vulnerability and that as a learned skill for a company, that is brilliant. And how you just described this concept of trust as a learned skill, and that you've seen and you have the data with companies demonstrating that when they do this and when they mature along those lines, you see real measurable improvement.
Yeah.
Wow. So switching gears a bit. So what's often misunderstood about your role or when, Vaconic comes in with a company to do work? Do you find yourself ever misunderstood or there's a gap between the expectation and reality, especially from the company point of view?
Like, I think sometimes it's rarely that we're misunderstood. Our role is misunderstood by those that directly engage us. So that would be social performance professionals or functions within a business. They know us, they know our work, they might have read the papers and seen me drone on about our work at conferences over the years and throw the arms around, So they're pretty on board. They know what they're getting and they're really keen and up for it. I think where we get a little bit misunderstood is through other functions in the business who just have a really different approach to these relationships with the external world. So whether that might be a communications function or an external relations function or a legal function, and it takes some time to help them to understand that we're actually not trying to hang you out to dry or to make your lives more complicated, or we're actually, through a business lens, we're trying to make critical risks visible and to do that in ways that the organization can understand and take action around. So the language of organizations is data. And to provide a social performance function with a language that the rest of the business can understand and engage with, that's really powerful. So if you look at the Lundin example where our data is used to get a sustainability linked loan, $2.5 billion USD based on, in part, so half of the data is around greenhouse gas abatement, the other half is around procedural fairness scores. So can you imagine that? A sustainability linked loan will deliver better rates on that loan over time if Lundin can demonstrate that they are outperforming their goals on procedural fairness with communities that they operate alongside. It's transformational and it aligns fundamentally the interests and the language of business, company and finance with the interests and language of community, which is stronger relationships. So this is the future. This is amazing, exciting things that can happen by finding the way to fit together those worlds, find the connective tissue that allows them to be a greater whole, if you like, and to be able to engage with each other inside a business to then engage externally from the business in new ways. It's fascinating to watch and great to be a part of.
I think it's interesting. I completely agree. And the sustainability bond to these scores is wow. I will point out that you started by saying that the function, when I asked what it was often misunderstood, you started by saying the communications function. And I wanted to highlight that because I've worked alongside the communications team my whole career. They do brilliant work, but I often see that it is misunderstood because their role is to take the company message out. And
Yeah.
what you're doing is the opposite. It's what the company hears. And that often I do see that there is a confusion from this technical field within the company of understanding that key distinction.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So I always end my sessions with the same question. What advice do you have for others to have success in this field?
It depends on what field. Maybe I'll speak to two fields. One is sort of academic practitioners, and the other is social performance. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I'm so tempted to slip in the little detail I learned about you that you almost were a professional golfer, but I'll leave that
No.
aside. And stick to social performance and entrepreneurship. I mean, I still think it's pretty incredible that you have transformed your career from working at a mine site to having a very significant, not just academic career, but at the leading institution of the country, and then an entrepreneur. So I actually think that you could give advice across several fields, but I'll let you choose.
I'd just say, in terms of our process in taking science and turning it into a thing, the whole point of that was to maximize the impact that we could have from that science because we believe in it, because we believe in what we're trying to describe with that science. And there are some things that we've learned along the way that I think are universal, that have value to reflect on. One is you've got to turn up. So I joke that I got to platinum status on Qantas flying ready deals domestically in Australia. So for those not in Australia, that's like the cheapest flight you can get. And I got to the most highest level of airline kind of status. I was just on planes a lot to present this work, to engage with practitioners on the ground, to do conferences and all sorts of things. And I think most important part, which is there are tons of good ideas in the world, but unless you're solving a problem, you're wasting time. So nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to engage in the way that you hope if you're not actually solving a material problem for somebody. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what problem we're trying to solve. What can we learn from the work that we're doing to make what we're doing better and to do that quicker than anybody else so that we can, I guess, continue to live this journey of having impact from the science. And for practitioners, I would say my advice is it's okay not to understand data and not to understand statistics and that, but the job is to find the story in data and to demand more of those people giving it to you. And so in our work, we don't sort of drop a report and walk away. We provide a dashboard and we walk people through the dashboard of all the data. And we identify those narratives and we reflect on them together and we discuss them with multiple conversations about them. This is a really critical part of the process. So, I would say engage with data in ways that are meaningful for you. And at some point, you need to do the work. And the work is decide what it means for you. So often we'll get, this sort of sense of everyone's very busy and I just want the answer. But in this space, in the community space, you kind of have to go beyond the answer. You've got to find your way to the answer. And that's through just sort of letting the story wash over and around you and putting the pieces together in your own mind, your own data sources from those interactions that you're having day to day in person and putting that together in a meaningful way and then using the data to make your story compelling to other parts of the business and to use it in ways that support your relationships externally. So I'd say data is increasingly important in this space, and it's a really important skill for social practitioners, performance practitioners, to embrace that and to make it a powerful tool in their kit bag and a way to differentiate themselves and their company from others in these spaces.
Story from the data. I like that a lot. I didn't hear anything about how I'm going to play golf successfully, but maybe that will be our next chat.
Maybe.
Well, listen, I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot too. I mean, I've engaged with you quite a lot over the last number of months, and I learned a fair number of nuggets in this conversation. So thank you very much, Kieren.
It's always a pleasure. Great to speak with you, Alison.
Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please like, provide a 5-star review, and amplify.